There is a particular kind of person who confuses almost everyone who tries to love them. They show up, they handle responsibilities, they stay loyal in ways that are visible and measurable. They can be protective, consistent, and even deeply committed, but emotionally, they remain difficult to reach. Not because they do not care, but because something in them keeps a quiet distance that looks, from the outside, like coldness. In urticants, this pattern often creates a strange contradiction. The person may avoid deep conversations and quickly shift the topic when emotions appear. During conflict, they may become silent, shut down, or leave the room. When intimacy increases, they may become harder to access, disappearing into work, routine, or practical tasks. Their affection often arrives indirectly, fixing problems, managing logistics, providing stability, staying useful, but rarely through open emotional presence. For partners, children, and close friends, this can feel confusing. It is difficult to reconcile someone who is dependable with someone who feels emotionally absent. It creates the impression that love is being withheld, or that closeness is being avoided on purpose. But in many cases, emotional distance is not cruelty. It is not a lack of feeling. It is a learned form of internal regulation. Some nervous systems were shaped in environments where emotional expression did not lead to comfort. In those settings, being emotionally open could invite punishment, mockery, or rejection. Over time, distance becomes a protective structure. It becomes a way to stay stable, functional, and in control. The question is not whether these people love. The question is what psychological system creates a person who can be present in every practical way, yet remain emotionally unreachable. Emotional distance is often treated as a personality defect, as if some people are simply less capable of love or empathy. But in many cases, it functions more like an internal emotional management system. It is not the absence of emotion. It is the deliberate reduction of emotional intensity, often automatic, designed to maintain stability. For some individuals, emotional closeness activates stress rather than comfort. Their nervous system does not interpret intimacy as a safe connection. It interprets it as exposure, unpredictability, or loss of control. Distance becomes the method that keeps their internal world organized. They may not describe it this way, but they often experience closeness as mentally noisy. Emotional demands create a sense of pressure, as if something is being asked of them that they cannot provide without becoming overwhelmed. This pattern is frequently formed in early environments where emotions were ignored, mocked, punished, or treated as weakness. If a child learns that sadness brings dismissal, anger brings consequences, or fear brings humiliation, the brain adapts. It stops broadcasting emotional signals because those signals do not lead to resolution. Instead, they lead to discomfort. The child learns that emotional expression is not a pathway to support, it is a liability. Over time, the mind becomes skilled at intellectualizing feelings instead of experiencing them directly. The person learns to analyze emotion rather than inhabit it. They may explain what they think about a situation while struggling to articulate what they feel. This is not necessarily deception, it is conditioning. The emotional system becomes something to control rather than something to express. Neurologically, repeated suppression strengthens inhibition circuits. The brain becomes practiced at shutting down emotional activation. Emotional expression starts to feel unfamiliar, exhausting, even physically uncomfortable. In adulthood, this often appears as emotional minimalism, limited verbal affection, discomfort with emotional conversations, and preference for predictable functional interactions. Modern relationships, however, demand emotional transparency. They expect frequent reassurance and emotional validation. For someone whose stability depends on emotional containment, these expectations can feel overwhelming, even when love is present. Their strengths are often real: composure under pressure, independence, reliability, and low emotional impulsivity. But the limitation is equally real. In critical emotional moments, they may disconnect, creating misunderstandings that feel like abandonment to the people closest to them. Attachment psychology offers one of the clearest frameworks for understanding emotional distance, particularly through avoidant attachment patterns. In this model, emotional withdrawal is not simply a preference. It is often a conditioned response to close intimacy. Triggers threat perception, not because intimacy is inherently harmful, but because the nervous system associates closeness with disappointment, intrusion, or the loss of autonomy. Avoidant patterns frequently develop in childhood environments where emotional needs are met inconsistently or with irritation. A child might have caregivers who provided food, shelter, and structure, yet responded poorly to emotional dependence. Comfort might have been offered unpredictably, or only when it was convenient. Emotional expression may have been met with annoyance, minimization, or emotional absence. The child learns a quiet lesson: needing someone is risky. Over time, the child builds an internal rule that shapes their entire relational system. Dependence creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates disappointment. So the safest strategy becomes self-containment. They learn to rely on themselves, regulate alone, and keep emotional needs private. This is not always conscious. It is an adaptation that forms before language is fully developed. In adulthood, this can produce a paradoxical pattern. The person may genuinely desire connection, but when closeness becomes intense, the nervous system reacts with withdrawal. Emotional intimacy feels like being cornered. Requests for reassurance can feel like pressure. Emotional conversations can feel like interrogation. The person may not even understand why they feel tense. They may simply experience an internal urge to create distance, to return to the psychological breathing room. Modern relational culture intensifies this conflict. Many partnerships now interpret emotional openness as proof of love. When one person withdraws, the other often interprets it as rejection. The more one partner pursues closeness, the more the avoidant partner retreats, reinforcing insecurity on both sides. The pursuing partner feels abandoned. The retreating partner feels controlled. Over time, this cycle becomes self-confirming, creating relational strain even when both people care. A balanced view is necessary. Avoidant individuals often excel at self-sufficiency and problem-solving. They can remain calm in emergencies. They often think clearly under pressure. But their limitation is emotional reciprocity. When closeness requires vulnerability, reassurance, and emotional exposure, they may shut down. Their withdrawal is not always a sign of lack of love. It is often a sign of an attachment system that interprets intimacy as real. For some emotionally distant individuals, the issue is not primarily attachment fear, it is identity. They build their sense of worth around competence, rather than connection. They feel valuable when they are productive, useful, and in control. Emotional expression becomes secondary, and emotional dependence becomes threatening, because it cannot be solved the way tasks can. This identity often forms in early environments where responsibility was rewarded more than emotional presence. Some were parentified, forced into maturity too early, expected to manage household instability, care for siblings, or absorb adult stress before they had the emotional capacity to process it. Others grew up in families where affection was conditional, given mainly through praise for achievement. Emotional needs might not have been punished, but they were not prioritized. The message was subtle but powerful. Performance creates safety. In these environments, emotions are treated as distractions. Practical survival matters more than emotional comfort. The brain adapts by equating control with stability. Emotional dependence becomes associated with chaos, because emotions are unpredictable and cannot be measured. Competence, on the other hand, can be measured. It creates structure. It creates certainty. In adulthood, this can produce a person who appears strong and reliable. They provide financially. They handle crises. They manage responsibilities with impressive discipline. They often show care through action, fixing problems, offering solutions, organizing life, staying present through effort rather than emotional conversation. Their loyalty is often expressed through consistency, not verbal reassurance. But when faced with emotional uncertainty, grief, fear, insecurity, relational ambiguity, they may shut down. They may become quiet, distant, or impatient. Emotional needs may feel like unsolvable problems, and because they cannot fix them, they feel powerless. That powerlessness is uncomfortable. It threatens the identity they have built. Modern emotional culture often expects people to communicate feelings openly and engage in reassurance. For competence-driven individuals, this can feel inefficient, even irrational. They may believe they are already showing love in the highest form they know, stability and function. To others, this can look like coldness. Their strengths are real: resilience, responsibility, long-term commitment, and crisis stability. But the limitations are also clear. Emotional needs can become invisible. Partners may feel lonely beside someone who is always present physically, but absent emotionally. Over time, emotional distance becomes not an intentional rejection, but the byproduct of a personality built around performance instead of connection. Another common foundation of emotional distance is emotional inhibition, the learned belief that strong feelings are dangerous, embarrassing, or burdensome. This does not mean the person lacks emotion. It means they fear what emotion will cause if it becomes visible. The origins of this pattern often trace back to early experiences of shame. A child cries and is mocked. A child expresses anger and is punished. A child shows fear and is told to stop being weak. In emotionally harsh environments, the repeated instruction is simple. Strong emotion creates problems. It creates rejection. It creates humiliation. Over time, the child internalizes the idea that emotional expression makes them unacceptable. The nervous system adapts accordingly. Suppression becomes automatic. Instead of allowing sadness, anger, or fear to move outward, the person learns to compress it inward. Emotional expression becomes associated with danger, so the mind learns to keep emotional life private. This is not necessarily a conscious decision. It becomes an instinctive protective reflex. Psychologically, the cost of suppression is that emotion does not disappear, it changes form. Instead of sadness, the person may experience numbness. Instead of fear, they may experience irritability. Instead of anger, they may experience detachment. Their emotional experience becomes less clear and harder to translate into language. Over time, they may feel disconnected from their own emotional states, not because they have none, but because they have practiced hiding them for so long. In adulthood, this appears as emotional silence. The person may avoid emotional discussions, struggle to describe feelings, or respond to emotional situations with short statements. They may exit conversations quickly, not because they do not care, but because emotional intensity activates discomfort and shame. Loved ones often interpret this silence as indifference. Internally, it may be overwhelming, confusion, or a fear of becoming too much. Modern relational expectations intensify this pressure. Emotional openness is now treated as a sign of maturity, sometimes even a moral standard. For emotionally inhibited individuals, this can create the sense that they are defective. That feeling of judgment increases withdrawal, because exposure becomes even riskier. Their strengths often include emotional control, stability, and low dramatization. They rarely escalate conflict impulsively, but the limitations are significant. They may struggle to receive support, they may carry distress alone, and the people around them may feel emotionally shut out. Misreading inhibition as lack of hyper-independence is one of the most common foundations of emotional distance. It develops when a person learns through repeated experience that relying on others is unreliable or unsafe. Over time, the individual builds an identity around needing no. Emotional distance becomes part of maintaining that independence. This pattern often begins in childhood environments shaped by neglect, emotional absence, unstable family structures, or repeated disappointment. A child may have learned that emotional needs were inconvenient. To others, comfort may not have arrived when it was required. Support may have been inconsistent, conditional, or absent entirely. In such environments, needing people does not feel like connection. It feels like vulnerability followed by pain. The brain adapts by reducing dependence. The child learns to self-soothe, self-manage, and stop expecting emotional rescue. At first, this is survival. It is the only reliable way to stay psychologically stable. But over time, it becomes an identity. The person becomes proud of their endurance. They equate strength with emotional self-sufficiency. Neurologically, repeated experiences of abandonment or inconsistency can train the nervous system toward vigilance. Closeness becomes associated with the person may carry an unconscious belief that intimacy will eventually lead to disappointment, betrayal, or loss of control. Emotional distance becomes a preemptive defense. If they do not rely on anyone, they cannot be abandoned. In adulthood, hyper-independence shows up as difficulty asking for help. They reject comfort even when they need it. During stress, they withdraw and handle problems alone. They may feel uncomfortable when someone tries to support them emotionally, because support feels like exposure. They may interpret kindness as obligation, closeness as potential dependency, and dependency as danger. In modern relationships, mutual support and shared vulnerability are often central expectations. Emotional teamwork is treated as intimacy. For hyper-independent individuals, these expectations can feel invasive. They may experience emotional support not as comfort, but as the risk of being seen, the risk of being indebted, or the risk of being emotionally trapped. Their strengths include endurance, competence under stress, and impressive self-reliance. But the limitations include emotional loneliness and relational imbalance. Partners may feel locked out of their internal world. Over time, the relationship may begin to feel one-sided, where emotional closeness is always requested by one person and avoided by the other, not because love is absent, but because independence has become the primary survival language. Emotional distance also functions as conflict avoidance. For some individuals, closeness is psychologically linked to emotional chaos. They associate intimacy with arguments, instability, or unpredictable escalation. As a result, they keep emotional distance to preserve peace and reduce perceived threat. This pattern often forms in environments where emotional expression led to conflict rather than resolution. Some grew up in households with frequent shouting, volatile anger, manipulation, or emotional unpredictability. In such settings, emotions were not safe signals, they were triggered. When someone expressed feelings, the situation became dangerous. The child learns that emotional engagement leads to escalation. The safest strategy becomes withdrawal. Silence becomes protection. Emotional neutrality becomes a way to avoid provoking someone else's instability. Over time, the nervous system learns to shut down during intensity. The person may not consciously choose avoidance. Their body simply moves into a freeze response, reducing emotional output to prevent threat. In adulthood, this pattern appears clearly during emotionally intense moments. The person may become quiet, stop responding, avoid discussion, or physically leave. They may disengage during conflict not to punish the other person, but to stabilize their own nervous system. They often experience emotional conversations as unpredictable and exhausting. Even mild confrontation can activate a disproportionate sense of danger. Modern relationship expectations often misinterpret this behavior. Many people view emotional withdrawal as disrespect, passive aggression, or refusal to communicate. But for the emotionally distant person, withdrawal may feel like emotional survival. They may believe that staying engaged will lead to escalation, loss of control, or emotional collapse. So they retreat to restore calm. A balanced view shows both sides. These individuals often have strengths. They are less likely to engage in impulsive aggression, less likely to escalate conflict dramatically, and often capable of maintaining outward calm. But the limitations are serious. Avoidance prevents resolution. Emotional tension accumulates slowly, stored in silence rather than processed openly. Over time, partners may begin to feel they are living beside someone, rather than with them. Conflict does not disappear, it becomes an unspoken distance. The relationship may remain functional, but emotionally hollow. In this way, emotional withdrawal becomes a long-term threat management strategy that protects the individual's nervous system, while quietly eroding intimacy. Emotional distance can develop when a person has low emotional literacy, difficulty identifying, naming, and interpreting internal emotional states. In these cases, the person may not be withholding emotion intentionally. They may simply lack the internal vocabulary required for emotional engagement. Emotional literacy is not automatic. It develops through exposure and practice. In families where emotions are discussed openly, children learn to label their internal experience. They learn the difference between sadness and disappointment, between anger and shame, between fear and uncertainty. But in emotionally silent environments, this learning does not occur. The child may grow up with minimal emotional language, receiving little guidance about how emotions function. Cultural environments can reinforce this. Some households treat emotional discussion as unnecessary. Others view emotional expression as private or irrelevant. In these contexts, emotions exist, but they are not articulate. The brain does not develop strong emotional labeling skills, because it has not been trained to observe and translate internal states into words. Psychologically, when emotions are unclear, they become uncomfortable without meaning. The person may feel agitation, heaviness, or tension, but not know what it represents. Without clarity, emotional situations become confusing. Instead of expressing feelings, the person avoids situations that require emotional complexity. Over time, avoidance becomes a habit, and that habit looks like emotional distance. In adulthood, this may appear as confusion during emotional conversations. The person may respond with logic, solutions, or practical analysis, because that is the only language they trust. They may appear indifferent, but internally they may be unsure what is expected. They may not understand why a partner wants verbal reassurance, because they do not naturally process emotion in that form. Modern emotional culture places heavy emphasis on self-awareness and communication. Emotional reflection is often treated as relational competence. For emotionally low literacy individuals, these expectations can feel overwhelming or pointless, not because they reject intimacy, but because they do not know how to participate in. Their strengths are often rationality and stability. They can think clearly, solve problems, and avoid emotional impulsivity, but their limitations include miscommunication, frustration in partners, and a persistent sense that emotional closeness is complicated and inaccessible. The distance is not always intentional. Sometimes it is the result of a system that never learned how to translate feeling into connection. Emotional distance is not always a personal choice. Often, it is socially certain cultures, generations, and environments reward emotional restraint and treat openness as weakness. In these contexts, emotional distance is not considered a flaw. It is considered maturity. Many people grew up in family structures where affection was expressed in direct care was shown through providing, protecting, and maintaining stability, not through emotional conversation. In some households, verbal affirmation was rare. Emotional discussions were not part of daily life. The absence of emotional expression was normal. Even gender socialization often reinforces this pattern. In many environments, boys are taught that emotional expression is vulnerability, and vulnerability is dangerous. They are encouraged to be strong, controlled, and restrained, but this conditioning can apply beyond gender. Entire communities can treat emotional openness as inappropriate, unstable, or childish. Emotional restraint becomes associated with dignity and self-respect. Cultural reinforcement shapes behavior over decades. When a person is praised for being calm, silent, and unreactive, they internalize that identity. They learn that emotional containment earns respect. Emotional openness may feel embarrassing, like breaking an unspoken rule. Over time, emotional distance becomes not just habit, but social conformity. Modern systems create friction because emotional norms have shifted. Contemporary relationships often prioritize vulnerability, transparency, and constant emotional check-in. For emotionally restrained individuals, these demands can feel unnatural and exhausting. They may interpret emotional openness as oversharing or emotional instability. They may feel pressured to perform a style of intimacy that does not align with their A balanced view acknowledges that cultural restraint can produce real strengths. It often builds endurance, patience, and emotional control. It reduces impulsive dramatization, but it can also create emotional loneliness and poor relational communication. Generational misunderstandings emerge when younger family members interpret restraint as neglect, while older individuals interpret emotional demands as excessive. In this way, emotional distance is sometimes not a personal psychological defense, but a socially inherited structure. The person is not choosing coldness. They are operating within a model of emotional behavior that was once considered normal, and in many places still is. In modern relationship language, emotional distance is frequently labeled as narcissism. Detachment is often interpreted as selfishness, lack of empathy, or manipulation. But emotional unavailability is not always the same as emotional cruelty. The difference lies in motive and internal experience. Emotionally distant individuals may appear dismissive. They may seem uninterested in another person's feelings. They may respond to emotional needs with silence, irritation, or avoidance. From the outside, this can look like entitlement, as if they believe other people's emotions are inconvenient. In some cases, this interpretation is accurate, but in many cases, it is not. Defensive emotional withdrawal
often comes from emotional unsafety, not from a desire for control. The emotionally distant person may experience guilt and stress internally. They may feel overwhelmed by emotional demands and unsure how to respond. Their withdrawal is not necessarily designed to punish. It is designed to regulate their own discomfort. They may care deeply, but lack the capacity to stay emotionally present under pressure. Modern social media psychology language intensifies mislabel. Terms like toxic, narcissist, and emotionally abusive are often used broadly, sometimes as shorthand for any painful relational behavior. This can create an environment where emotional distance is automatically framed as malicious. The result is that emotional distance is not understood as an adaptation. It is treated as a moral defect. At the same time, accurate categorization does not remove the impact. Emotional distance can still cause harm. Loved ones may feel rejected, unseen, and emotionally deprived. Even without malicious intent, the outcome can be relational pain. Emotional silence can feel like invalidation. Withdrawal can feel like abandonment. Practical support can feel meaningless when emotional presence is absent. A balanced view recognizes that emotionally distant individuals often have strengths: loyalty, stability, reduced emotional drama, and consistency. But their limitations can create repeated rupture. They may unintentionally dismiss the emotional reality of others. They may fail to provide reassurance when it is needed most. Their behavior can leave others feeling isolated, even in a committed relationship. The goal is not to defend emotional distance, it is to distinguish it. Emotional coldness is not always emotional cruelty. Sometimes it is a defensive structure, sometimes it is an inability, and sometimes it is a learned survival pattern that looks from the outside like something far more deliberate than it actually is. Across different psychological frameworks, emotional distance rarely appears as randomness. It is usually a structured survival pattern shaped by early experiences and reinforced over time. Avoidant attachment teaches the nervous system that closeness carries risk. Emotional inhibition teaches that expression invites shame. Hyper-independence teaches that reliance leads to pain. Competence identity teaches that worth is earned through function, not vulnerability. Conflict avoidance teaches that emotional engagement leads to instability. Emotional literacy deficits limit the ability to translate feelings into language. Cultural conditioning normalizes restraint as maturity. When these mechanisms combine, the result is a person who is not emotionally empty, but emotionally controlled. Their nervous system prioritizes stability over intimacy. Their identity may be built around self-containment. They may feel safest when they are calm, self-reliant, and emotionally quiet. In many environments, this works well. Workplaces reward composure. Crisis situations reward emotional control. High responsibility roles reward function and endurance. This is why emotionally distant individuals often appear capable, disciplined, and successful. But modern relational systems expose the cost of this adaptation. Contemporary relationships are increasingly structured around emotional transparency. Verbal emotional availability has become a primary standard of intimacy. Partners expect reassurance, reflection, and emotional response. As these expectations rise, emotionally distant individuals may appear increasingly incompatible with intimacy-based relationship models, even though their pattern was once socially common, and in some environments still is. What creates the friction is not necessarily lack of love, it is a mismatch. A survival architecture built for earlier conditions is now operating in a world that demands emotional presence. The person may still show loyalty through stability, responsibility, and protection, but the people around them may experience that stability as emotional absence. In this sense, emotional distance is not simply a relationship problem. It is often a psychological structure that once reduced pain, reduced chaos, and preserved control. In a high emotion era, that same structure becomes visible, it becomes misunderstood, and it becomes difficult to maintain without creating relational cost. Understanding emotional distance requires precision rather than judgment. It is often not cruel, it is not always narcissism, it is frequently a nervous system strategy that once made sense and now quietly collides with the emotional expectations of modern connection.